apparently don't know the word for anything. I don't know words for nothing. Hang on 1 second. I need to do some adjustments. How is everybody doing today? Woo! Whoa, look at my neck. My neck's so weird. Weird neck. Hi, best friend. How you doing? Hello to my other friends as well. I'm sorry you're still sick, Britt. I'm glad you're here to party. I hope your Thanksgiving wasn't completely miserable because you were sick. Thank you for shouting out all the friends. I appreciate it. Hello, everybody. Hopefully you guys can hear the music. If you cannot, please let me know. I'm gonna cut this down a little bit. Okay. You can hear the music. Good. If the music gets too loud, please let me know. This is kind of a quieter song, so I shouldn't be too worried. Okay, we have let me count. I think we have 6 chapters, about 50 pages left. Yeah, six chapters, 50 pages left of Secret of the Scarlet Hand. It's fitting that Nicole was playing this just a little bit ago. What, a little over an hour ago? 'Cause now we can read the version, the book version. I'm calling host streams. I'm calling this the read. It was okay. Slept most of the day when my mom brought me a plate of turkey, mac and cheese, rolls and peas, and pecan pie and straw. Ooh, that sounds delightful, though. I'm glad your mom was able to bring you some food. Yeah, the read version. Alright, I'm just gonna hope that's good. Moms are the best. I mean, at least it was a relaxing day, right? Right? It's the best I got, I'm sorry. Today I put up half of the Christmas decorations at work. That place is big. It has 6 Christmas trees as well as other decorations throughout the building. I was able to do half of the lobby and 3 of the 6 trees, and then I'll have to do the rest on Tuesday afternoon. But anyway, it's been a lovely day. Because of that, it's gotten me into the Christmas spirit, and I was listening to Christmas music all day. But thank you, really, thank you. I got some Chick-fil-A on my way home, so I have my tea to drink, keeping my mouth nice and moist. For all of you people who hate that word, there's a little bit of ASMR hatred that you can start developing for me. Okay, I'm just rambling at this point. So, without further ado, if everyone is ready, I think I'm going to go ahead and jump into the book. If at any point the music gets too loud or too soft, please tell me so that I can adjust. Okay. To a quick recap. I remember that Nancy went to a cult party and got drugged, and then they found out that John Riggs is #1 suspect in who spiked the drink category, and that's where we ended off. Okay, here we go. Chapter 11. The Missing Papers. John Riggs was in his office when the girls arrived. Nancy immediately pulled the cup out of her bag and placed it on his desk. "Can you tell me where this came from?" she asked. He looked startled, but picked up his glasses and examined the goblet carefully. "It's Mexican pottery," he said. "It's cheap and mass-produced." "Do the glyphs mean anything?" He shook his head. "They're just decorative." He handed the goblet back to Nancy. "Did you think it was antique?" No, Nancy said. I was given a drink in it last night at a ceremony I attended out in Maryland. She paused. And I believe you were there? Riggs shifted in his chair. What makes you think that? He asked. I saw you, Nancy replied matter-of-factly. And why were you there? He asked, his face showing no emotion. Research? Nancy stared at him, waiting for him to say more. I guess you caught me, he said with a sigh. Yes, I was at the house. What do you mean I caught you? Nancy asked. Was Riggs going to confess this easily? I don't like it to be known that I lead those ceremonies for the society, he said. She watched as his freckled face turned red. It's a group of amateurs, ordinary people interested in the Maya. Scholars and serious art collectors think it's silly, but I enjoy it, he added defensively. Nancy glanced at the table behind John Riggs's desk. He seemed sincere, but what about the other evidence that seemed to implicate him? The brushes, ink, and cinnabar still sat on the table. She gestured toward the bottle. I thought you said you had no cinnabar, she said. Huh? Riggs looked over his shoulder at the table. Oh, those things. They just showed up the other day. I thought maybe a student had borrowed them and was finally returning them. Nancy strolled over to the table and picked up the bottle. The chemical house that sells this stuff says you ordered some last month, she said. What? Riggs stared at her with an astonished expression. I didn't order cinnabar. My guess is that these materials are what's been used to write the notes I've been showing you, Nancy went on. Riggs gave her a panicked look. Are you saying I wrote them? I'm not saying anything, Nancy replied evenly. John Riggs rose from his desk. I didn't write those notes. Then you probably won't mind if I take a sample of this cinnabar to the police detective investigating the theft of Lord Pakal. She poured some out into a scrap of paper just as she had the other day. She was hoping to provoke some kind of reaction from Riggs. His lab can analyze it and find out whether it was used to make the notes. Riggs shrugged. Fine. The police can test all they want, but I want you and the police to know that I had nothing to do with that theft. Nancy studied his face as he spoke. The police are conducting a thorough investigation. I'm sure they'll get to the bottom of this. Then she scooped up the goblet and the cinnabar sample and left the office. Bess and George hurried after her. What do you think, Nan? George asked once they were down the corridor. Is he guilty? Nancy sighed. I'm not sure, she answered truthfully. He doesn't strike me as a liar. She stood lost in her thoughts for a moment. I'd like to visit Henrik Vanderheun next, she told her friends. Somehow I think he holds the key to this mystery. Henrik Vanderheun was sitting up in bed when they arrived at the hospital. As Nancy and her friends entered his room, he reached for his thick glasses and put them on. He still looks confused, Nancy thought with a sinking heart. He's not going to remember anything. Do I know you? He asked in his thick accent. Nancy approached his bed and stood next to him quietly. I'm Susan Caldwell's friend Nancy Drew, she said. I met you the day you were hurt. In fact, I was there when the statue fell. He nodded. Yes, Susan told me about a young lady and that she was with me. Mr. Vanderheun, Nancy began, I saw you at the Mexican consulate the morning of the accident. Do you remember why you were there? He frowned. I'm afraid I still don't remember much of that day or the days before it. The doctors say I should get my memory back. I wish they could say when. Then you don't remember arguing with Taylor Sinclair, Nancy probed, because I saw you two exchange some fairly heated words that morning. Vanderheun squinted, trying to remember. Taylor, he mumbled. Well, I remember something about, bad business? What kind of bad business? Nancy asked. Vanderheun sighed. It's all such a blur in my mind. So frustrating. His voice trailed off. Mr. Vanderheun, I'm trying to help Susan find out how the Lord Pakal carving was stolen, Nancy pleaded. Can you remember anything that could help me? Anything at all? The older man leaned back on his pillows and closed his eyes for a moment. He said nothing. You were carrying the provenance documents when you were hit by that falling statue. Did you have those for a reason? Nancy asked. Vanderheun's eyes fluttered open. The provenance documents, he murmured. Something in them wasn't right. Wasn't right? Nancy echoed. He sighed again. That's all I could tell you. The answer must be there, with the papers. Nancy stood. She'd gotten all she could from the museum curator. She apologized for disturbing him, and the girls left. Poor Henrik, she remarked on the way out of the hospital. He'll eventually get his memory back, but it must be frustrating. For him and us, George put in. Where next? Bess asked. Beach Hill, Nancy replied. Let's take another look at those provenance documents. At Beach Hill, Nancy told Susan Caldwell about her visit with Henrik Vanderheun, as well as about the ceremony the night before. When Nancy mentioned being drugged and abducted, Susan's mouth dropped open. "Oh, Nancy," she murmured. "When I asked for your help, I had no idea something like this would happen." "I'm fine now," Nancy reassured her, just more determined than ever to figure out what is going on. "Do you know anything about the Pre-Columbian Society?" "Oh, that." Susan waved her hand dismissively. "I went to one of their rituals once." She shook her head. "Pretty amateur stuff. I have trouble understanding why Riggs would associate with them." Nancy could see why John Riggs might want to conceal his involvement with the group, because Susan clearly did not think much of them. "The society is a well-meaning group of people with a genuine interest in Mayan culture," Susan explained, "but they don't have advanced degrees. In the museum world, that makes them persona non grata." She saw the blank looks on the girls' faces. "That's Latin," she explained. "It means people you don't want to hang around with." The girls nodded, and now they understood. "John Riggs's explanation of why he was at the party makes sense," Nancy said, "but we still found cinnabar ink and paper in his office. Things are not looking good for him." "Is there any evidence that would put him at the scene of the crime?" Susan asked. "Nothing substantial," Nancy told her. "Briscoe says Riggs wasn't seen at Beach Hill in any of the days leading up to the theft." "We have to look elsewhere then," Susan declared. "I just can't see Riggs as a thief." "I do have other leads," Nancy replied. "Henrik Vanderheun said he had the provenance documents with him that morning for a reason that he cannot remember, but he says they hold a clue." "They must," Susan agreed, "especially since Martinez seemed to want them so badly." "May I see them again?" Nancy asked. "Sure," the director replied. "I took them out of my drawer and put them back in Henrik's office. Let's go get them." The three girls followed her out her door, down the hall, and into Henrik's office. "I put them in his side drawer," Susan said, pulling the drawer open. "That's funny." She groped around inside. "They're not here." Her face froze. "Are you sure you put them in that drawer?" Nancy asked. "Positive," Susan said, her voice rising anxiously. "They're gone!" End of chapter 11. Hi, Timo. Thanks for the host. Hope you're doing well. Cold turkey leftovers. You're an animal. Have fun on your lurk. It's positively messy. I still love a good cult. Dramatic music for dramatic moments. Drugged and kidnapped. Just a normal day for Nancy. She fine. She good. Thank you for clapping. Thank you for clapping. Shall we press on? Chapter 12. A Slippery Character. Susan Caldwell raced back toward her office. The girls followed her as she poked her head into her assistant's office. "Sally, has anyone been in Henrik's office today?" she demanded. Sally shook her head. "Not that I've seen." "Has anyone borrowed the provenance documents?" Susan asked anxiously. Again, Sally shook her head. "Let's go back to Mr. Vanderheun's office and look around more carefully," Nancy suggested. "Maybe they're lying around somewhere else." The four of them turned the office upside down as they hunted for the documents, but they were nowhere to be found. "I don't even have any copies," Susan moaned, plopping miserably down in the desk chair. "It usually isn't necessary since we're such a small museum." "Does Taylor Sinclair have copies?" Nancy asked. Susan nodded. "At least there's some available record," she stated. She buried her face in her hands. "When will this end?" Nancy put a comforting hand on Susan Caldwell's shoulder. "As soon as possible, I promise," she said. "We're going straight to Briscoe's office now for an update. I'll call you later." Nancy, Bess, and George drove back to the Georgetown police station. When they entered Briscoe's office, he had a computer printout in front of him. He handed it to Nancy. "This list matches the license plate numbers you wrote down with their owners' names," he said. "Take a look." Nancy wasn't surprised to see John Riggs' name on the list. He'd already admitted he was there, but none of the other names looked familiar. It was no surprise that Ricardo Martinez's name hadn't shown up. Quickly, she brought Briscoe up to date on the latest developments, the disappearance of the provenance documents. I only saw Taylor Sinclair's copies the morning after the crime, said Briscoe. Vanderheun had the originals with him that morning, Nancy said, but then he was hurt. So Taylor Sinclair's the only one with copies? Briscoe asked. Nancy nodded. Briscoe seemed lost in thought for a moment. Then he remembered something. Oh, I've got the results of that cinnabar sample, he said, waving some computer paper. It matches up. The stuff in the bottle is the same stuff that's on the notes, he said. I'm not surprised, Nancy commented. I'm bringing John Riggs in for questioning, Briscoe said. He'll be here later this afternoon. Do you want to stop by? Nancy quickly agreed, flattered that Briscoe wanted to include her. Sure, she told him. The girls stopped for lunch at a little cafe on Wisconsin Avenue, the main thoroughfare that wound through Georgetown. Over thick club sandwiches, they decided to pay a visit to Taylor Sinclair to look at his copies of the Provenance documents. Taylor was finishing lunch when Nancy stepped into his office. Bess and George waited outside in the gallery. He motioned for her to sit while he brushed crumbs off his desk with a thick napkin. He tossed the napkin onto his plate, then handed a silver tray to his assistant, who took it out. How are you today? He asked Nancy, adjusting his silk tie. Fine, she replied. And how is the investigation? He asked. Coming along? Something about Taylor Sinclair's personality rubbed Nancy the wrong way. We're making some progress, she replied curtly. Good, he said, acting completely uninterested. If you don't mind my asking, why are you here? The originals of the Provenance documents are gone, she said. They've disappeared out of Henrik Vanderheun's office. Taylor commented. Detective Briscoe and I couldn't find the originals the morning after the theft either. Vanderheun had them with him that morning, Nancy said, but they were returned to his office after he was hurt, but now they've disappeared. And you assume someone stole them? Taylor asked in a bored voice. Nancy nodded. He shrugged. Who would want them? The sale is old business. I was hoping that you might have some insight into the details of the sale, Nancy told him. Anything more I can learn may help me with the case. The sale of the carving to Beach Hill was completely above board, Taylor Sinclair replied. I'm not sure what might help you. There was nothing mysterious about it. I think Ricardo Martinez may be involved in this theft, Nancy said. Do you know him? Ricardo! Sinclair exclaimed. You really think he's involved? He laughed. Yes, I do, Nancy said. He told Alejandro Del Rio that he knows who stole the carving. Sinclair continued to laugh loudly. My dear, he said finally, if I know Ricardo, he has no idea who stole the carving. All he's trying to do is make a bit of money out of this unfortunate occurrence. That's how he operates. He's a complete scoundrel. So you don't think he has anything to do with the theft? Nancy asked. Sinclair shook his head vehemently. Ricardo is a small-time crook, he pronounced. Stealing the carving of Lord Pakal would be out of his league. He's more of an art shoplifter. While he chuckled at his own joke, Nancy mulled over his words. From what Alejandro had said, Martinez was far from a small-time thief. Was Taylor Sinclair trying to mislead her, or did he just have a different opinion about what was major league art in the art world? Sinclair's intercom buzzed. He picked up the phone, frowned, and asked his assistant to have whoever it was call him back. Then he frowned again. Apparently the caller would not be put off. He put his hand over the mouthpiece. I've got to take this, he said. Please do, Nancy said. I just wanted to ask if I could look at your copies of the Provenance documents. Sinclair looked annoyed. I have no idea where they are, he said sharply. You'll have to get back to me on that. Frustrated, Nancy whirled around and left his office. She could hear him speak smoothly into the phone. Yes, he murmured. Next week, I promise. When she stepped into the gallery, Bess and George were bent over a display of pre-Columbian jewelry. Sinclair's assistant sat at his desk. Nancy glanced at his nameplate, Jim Nelson. The name seemed familiar for some reason. Can I help you? He asked. Nancy thought fast. Yes, she replied. Mr. Sinclair said that I could borrow his copies of the Provenance documents for the Lord Pakal carving. Jim nodded and walked over to the file cabinet. He quickly located the file and handed her the copies. Thank you, Jim, so much. Nancy smiled politely. Come on, guys, she called to Bess and George. They hurried after her as she rushed down the stairs. Out on the sidewalk, George turned to Nancy. What's up? I got copies of the Provenance documents, she explained. Let's just hope Sinclair's assistant doesn't mention to his boss that he gave them to me. What happened with Sinclair? Asked Bess. He clearly wasn't happy to see me, Nancy replied, and he wasn't about to give me the documents. Something weird is going on with him. I think we should add him to our list of suspects. Glancing at her watch, Nancy saw that it was time to return to the Georgetown police station to sit in on John Riggs' questioning. "Why don't you two head back to the hotel and wait for me there?" she said. "George, hold on to these copies of the provenance documents. I need to take a look at them later." In Briscoe's office, John Riggs was sitting across from the detectives. He looked angry. Nancy was surprised he had come alone. Why was he so sure of his innocence that he hadn't thought he needed a lawyer? "I've been talking to Mr. Riggs here. Maybe you'd like to hear his story, too," Briscoe said to Nancy. His face showed no trace of emotion. Nancy turned to John Riggs and waited for him to speak. "Detective Briscoe tells me that the cinnabar sample you took from the jar in my office matches up with the cinnabar found in the notes." He cleared his throat. "Apparently, that's enough to arrest and charge me with the theft of the carving of Lord Pakal." "Possession of incriminating evidence," Detective Briscoe stated. "But that's just it," Briggs said. "I never ordered that cinnabar, and I certainly never brought it into my office." "How did it get there, then?" Nancy asked. "I think it was planted," Riggs said firmly. He saw the surprise on Nancy's face and continued. "After you left the other day, I did a little detecting work of my own." Nancy glanced at Detective Briscoe. He sat listening carefully. "I called the chemical house and asked them about the order I supposedly made," Riggs told them. "Well, there was an order in my name. I asked them to what address it had been sent, and they told me it was sent to a post office box number in downtown Washington." Nancy's eyes returned to Briscoe. He sat there silently. "I don't have a post office box," John Riggs protested. "Somebody is trying to frame me." End of chapter 12. Quickly, Nancy had to solve 12 Sudokus to get the info she needed. A scoundrel. Doesn't Taylor say the word scoundrel in the game? Because when I was reading that, I could hear the word scoundrel in his voice in my head. All right. It's a magical scoundrel. We only have 4 more chapters. Chapter 13. I'm gonna skip this song. The carousels are cool, but it's a little distracting. Chapter 13. A clue from the past. "I checked it out," Briscoe told Nancy as she sat puzzling over John Riggs' announcement. "The chemical house confirmed that the cinnabar was sent to a post office box number." He waved a sheet of paper. "I've got a search warrant. I'm going downtown to learn more about this box. Like to come?" Nancy nodded. "I'd like to come too," Riggs spoke up. "My name and reputation are at stake here." Detective Briscoe shook his head, then abruptly changed his mind. "Okay," he told Riggs. Nancy was puzzled. Why would Briscoe allow a suspect to come along on an investigation? Maybe Briscoe thought Riggs could help them answer any questions that came up or incriminate himself further. The 3 of them then hopped into the detective's unmarked sedan. The detective navigated the busy city streets to a small brick post office. Briscoe flashed his police badge and the search warrant at one of the postal workers behind the counter. They were quickly led to a back office where Detective Briscoe gave the box number to a short man with a balding head. The clerk checked his files, then wrote down the name on a sheet of paper and handed it to Briscoe. Briscoe showed it to Riggs. "Look familiar?" he asked. Riggs shook his head. Nancy took the paper from Briscoe. "Jim Nelson!" she exclaimed. "He's Taylor Sinclair's assistant, and—" Her voice trailed off as she tried to think of where else she'd seen his name. "He's listed on the printout of car owners at that house last night." "Let's go," Briscoe commanded. Without another word, the 2 men and Nancy got into the detective's car and headed straight for Taylor Sinclair's gallery. When they got there, Jim Nelson was sitting at his desk leafing through a magazine. Briscoe showed him his badge and the young man sat right up. Can I help you?" he stuttered. "We have a few questions," Nancy told him. "I'll be happy to answer them," Jim Nelson assured them. "Do you have a post office box?" Briscoe asked. The assistant looked puzzled for a second before he responded. "The gallery does," he said. "We were having trouble with our mail delivery here, and Mr. Sinclair decided it might be better to have a post office box. I arranged for it so it's in my name." "Did you order a bottle of cinnabar recently and have it sent to that box?" Briscoe asked. asked. The young man's forehead wrinkled. Cinnamon? Cinnabar, Briscoe corrected. It's a red powder? Jim still looked confused. No, I didn't, he answered. Briscoe nodded. You know I'm looking for the carving of Lord Pakal, don't you? Yes, Jim replied, and I know you're not having much luck finding it. Is that what Taylor Sinclair told you? Briscoe asked. Jim Nelson shifted uneasily in his chair. Yes, he said. With a glance at Briscoe, Nancy asked, Do you remember where you were last night? Nelson thought for a moment. I was with some friends at a club in Georgetown until about 11 o'clock, he replied. Then I went home. Your friends will vouch for you? Nancy asked. Of course, Nelson replied. Briscoe took the printout from his file. I have a list here of the owners of some cars that were parked by a house in Maryland last night. One of those cars belongs to you. He showed Jim the printout and his name. Jim put his finger on his name. Nancy saw his hand begin to tremble. He pulled his hand back and put it in his lap. I was at the club, I swear it, he insisted. Did somebody else have your car? Nancy asked. He was silent. Please answer, Briscoe nodded. I'd like to know too. Does anyone else drive your car? Jim looked down at the desk and let out a deep sigh. Mr. Sinclair does sometimes, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Did he borrow it last night? Nancy asked. Yes, Jim answered. He said he'd left his car out at his country place and he had to go to a meeting in the suburbs. Just one more question, Nancy went on. Who picks up the mail, do you? Jim shook his head. No, he said, the only one who has a key to that box is Taylor. The police detective thanked the assistant and told him he would need to remain available for further questioning. Then Briscoe, Nancy, and Riggs returned to Briscoe's car. Well, I guess you're off the hook now, said Briscoe to Riggs, who sat in the back seat. Thanks, Riggs mumbled. I told you I wasn't involved. Nancy turned around to face Riggs. What do you make of this? She told him what she knew about Taylor Sinclair, that he'd argued with Henrik Vanderheun at Beach Hill the morning after the theft, and that he'd been in the garden just before Vanderheun was hurt. He's also got money problems, John Riggs added. This was the first Nancy had heard of this. Are you sure? Riggs nodded. His sales have been slow this year, he said. He complained to me about it a couple months ago. Nancy and Briscoe looked at each other. This was important information. Not many people are aware of that, Riggs went on, but Taylor Sinclair knows even more about Mayan glyphs than I do. He's also an excellent artist. I believe it's time to bring Mr. Sinclair in for questioning, Briscoe announced in a determined tone. We don't have enough evidence to charge him with anything, but maybe we can get him to reveal something. I think you should wait, Nancy spoke up. During my visit today, I mentioned Ricardo Martinez and the missing provenance documents. Taylor's bound to be at least a little worried. Maybe he'll make some kind of move. Briscoe considered this. You may be right, Nancy, but if he is our thief, I don't want him to get away. He could skip the country with that carving. Nancy nodded. I know it's a risk, she said, but I think it'll be worth it. Okay, Briscoe agreed a moment later. So far you've been right on nearly every count, so I'm going to trust your judgment. Thank you, Detective, she said, smiling at him. I'll try not to let you down. That night, Nancy met Bess and George at the hotel restaurant for dinner. Her father had to attend a dinner meeting, but he had promised to meet them later. Alejandro called while you were out, Nancy, Bess said, looking up from her menu. I told him to meet us here so you could fill him in on the latest developments in the case. Good, Nancy said. Luckily, there's a lot to tell him. She proceeded to bring her friends up to date on the day's events. Bess and George listened wide-eyed when she got to the part about Jim Nelson, the post office box, and his borrowed car. So Taylor Sinclair was at the ceremony too? George exclaimed. Do you think Sinclair could have been involved in drugging your hot cocoa? Maybe, said Nancy. According to John Riggs, he's desperate for money, and that's usually a strong motive. Always a strong motive, a young man's voice said behind them. Nancy turned around in her seat. Hi, Alejandro. The Mexican diplomat pulled out a chair and sat down with the girls. Tell me your news, he said. Briefly, Nancy told him what she had just told her friends, that John Riggs had been cleared of any wrongdoing and that Taylor Sinclair was rapidly becoming their prime suspect. That still leaves Ricardo Martinez's involvement a big question mark, she finished. I can't figure out how he fits in. It is a puzzle, Alejandro agreed. He pointed to the folder lying on the table. What's this? Nancy picked it up. These are Taylor Sinclair's copies of the provenance documents, she said. I hate to admit I've been sneaky, but I managed to trick Jim Nelson into giving them to me. Alejandro opened the folder. These are copies of the original that disappeared? Nancy nodded. When we saw Henrik Vanderheun this morning at the hospital, he told us that there was something wrong with the provenance documents, she explained. What exactly? Alejandro asked. Unfortunately, he can't remember, Nancy told him. But I have a feeling that if we could figure out what it is, we'd be able to solve this mystery. Alejandro flipped through the sheets of paper in the file. Here's the first bill of sale. He showed it to Nancy. She held it in her hand. Yes, the record of the Petersons buying the carving from the museum in Los Angeles. She looked at the piece of paper thoughtfully. They live near George's aunt in Connecticut. She glanced at the address, then felt a prickle of excitement on the back of her neck. George, didn't you notice the zip code when we looked at the originals? She asked. George took the paper. Yes, she said, I realized that the Petersons lived in the same town as my aunt. But look at this. Nancy thrust the paper at her friend. Do you see a zip code on Sinclair's copy? George shook her head. Look at the date, Nancy told her. 1955, George said. She thought about it for a minute. Hey! Suddenly she realized what Nancy had noticed. There were no zip codes in 1955, Nancy crowed triumphantly. I'll bet this bill of sale is a phony. End of chapter 13. Ate pecan pie from yesterday. Ooh, ooh. Sounds like Westworld music. I think it's all been Haunted Carousel. Salad. Oh, hey, Salad. We love you too. I hope that you have a wonderful night. Enjoy your movie. Thanks for stopping by. I did not know that zip codes did not exist in 1955. I'm curious about that now. I would have never known that, and the fact that Nancy knew that is very impressive. When were zip codes introduced? Pecan pie. Hello. Good evening. Okay. Oh, 1963. The 16... Wait, what the heck? By the early 1960s, a more organized system was needed, and a non-mandatory 5-digit zip code was introduced nationwide on July 1st, 1963. That's so weird. Who would have known that? I would not have known that. Yeah. I mean, education is very important. It's just that Nancy would be like, oh yeah, there were no zip codes in 1955 is like really strange. Okay. I have 3 more chapters. Okay. Chapter 14. Ring Around the Robber. That's what it says. Okay. Nancy, what are you saying? Asked Bess. That when Taylor Sinclair was trying to sell the statue to Beach Hill, he furnished a phony bill of sale, Nancy explained. He had to account for the carving's provenance, which he couldn't do without a record. In other words, he just made up Lord Pakal's history, Bess said. Exactly, Nancy told her friend. But he originally made a mistake and put a zip code on the Petersons' address, Alejandro put in. Then, realizing his mistake, he altered the copy. He showed Briscoe and us so we wouldn't find out, finished George. He was probably the one who stole the originals from Beach Hill, too, Nancy mused. He didn't want anyone to catch his slip-up. Perhaps Sinclair also stole the carving to keep anyone from finding out he'd faked the documents, Alejandro pointed out. The phony bill of sale calls the whole provenance of the carving into question, and if the carving never belonged to the Petersons, then where did he get it? When Carson Drew joined them in the restaurant a few minutes later, Nancy told him about their discovery. He agreed that the original document had to be a phony. But you'll need proof, he reminded them. The original is gone. That is a problem, Nancy agreed. But one person can help us, Henrik Vanderheun, if his memory is any better. Early the next morning, Nancy, Bess, George, and Alejandro arrived at the hospital to find Henrik Vanderheun sitting up in bed. He looked much more alert than the last time they'd seen him. He immediately recognized Nancy. Ah, the young lady who's looking for Lord Pakal, he said. I was going to call you as soon as I finished breakfast. He pushed the tray away from his bed and motioned for her to sit. Is your memory back? Nancy asked hopefully. Henrik nodded. It seems to be, at least partly. Something came to me when I woke up this morning. The bill of sale to the Petersons is a fake, isn't it? Nancy asked. You figured it out, Henrik declared. He sounded impressed. Nancy told him how they had come to the discovery just the night before. "That's what I was arguing about with Sinclair that morning, before I was hurt," Henrik said. "I was the one who approved the purchase of the carving of Lord Pakal, but afterward I felt uneasy about it. Something about that purchase letter of the Petersons didn't sit right with me." He shook his head. "I realized I had made a horrible mistake." "Was it the zip code that tipped you off?" George asked. Henrik nodded. "Exactly. I asked Taylor Sinclair about it. Several days before the theft, I told him there was something wrong with that letter. At first, he seemed very concerned. He suggested the Petersons might have created the phony document to conceal the fact that the piece had been smuggled out of Mexico years ago. He said he would talk to the lawyers representing the Petersons' estate and demand an explanation. Then he'd get back to me." "Did he?" Nancy asked. "No," he said. "Of course, when the carving disappeared, I was immediately suspicious. Only Susan and I had keys to the storeroom, but I knew Sinclair had been in there several times. I thought he might have figured out how to get in." "But you didn't mention any of this to the police." Alejandro looked puzzled. "Why not?" "I wanted to be sure," he replied. "So the next morning I did some investigating. I went to the Mexican consulate. They have copies of a limited edition catalog of the Petersons' collection published back in the 60s. Alejandro nodded. "You checked to see if the carving of Lord Pakal was in the book?" Nancy asked. "Right," Henrik Vanderheun said. "It wasn't. There was a carving assumed to be of Lord Pakal, but of very inferior quality. And so it had to be Sinclair who faked the document," Nancy said with a rising excitement. "That's what I was accusing him of that morning when you saw us," Henrik replied. "I told him I had the documents to prove it, right in my hand." "The provenance file," Nancy filled in. "Yes," Henrik said, "and you know what happened next." He touched his head and winced. "He pushed over the statue to knock you out so he could steal the documents," said George. "But I picked them up," Nancy remembered. "I had them in my hand when we brought you out to the ambulance. Sinclair must have really been angry when he ran around that wall and couldn't find them." "Do you know how Ricardo Martinez might fit into all of this?" Nancy asked Henrik. He shrugged. "Maybe Sinclair was going to sell the carving to Martinez for a huge amount of cash and then disappear from Washington. Martinez has the kind of connections you'd need to sell a piece like the carving." Nancy nodded. "That's my theory, too." A few minutes later, the girls and Alejandro said goodbye to Henrik and headed once again for Taylor Sinclair's gallery. As they parked outside, Nancy drew a deep breath. She wondered how she was going to force a confession from Sinclair without the faked documents in hand. Jim Nelson was sitting at his desk. "Mr. Sinclair isn't here," he said as soon as he saw them. "He's gone to his house in the country." "Can you give me the address?" Nancy asked. Jim avoided her eyes. "I've been told to not give out that information," he said. Nancy gulped. She'd practically promised Detective Briscoe that Sinclair would not get away. What if they couldn't find him? "You know that you'd be an accessory to a crime if what we think about Taylor Sinclair is true," Nancy stated. "What exactly is he suspected of?" Jim asked uneasily. "Stealing the carving of Lord Pakal from Beach Hill," Nancy said. "We think Taylor got it on the black market and phonied up documents for it." Jim's face turned pale. "Now will you tell us where his country house is?" Nancy asked. "I'll write down the address for you," he agreed. His tone turned bitter. "I don't know why I should feel any loyalty toward the man. I haven't been paid in weeks." "Mr. Sinclair's been having money problems, hasn't he?" Nancy asked. Jim nodded. "The past year has not been a good one." He stood up to find the address, and Nancy paced the gallery as she waited. In front of a display case, she paused to look at the objects inside. A strange carving in the shape of a jaguar, several hammered gold pieces of monkeys and snakes, and then her eyes lighted on a gold and jade ring, a ring she'd seen before. "Bess! George! Alejandro! Come here!" Nancy pointed to the ring. "I saw this ring the night of the ceremony." "What?" Bess rushed over. "The man who handed me that drink was wearing this," Nancy exclaimed. "That must have been Taylor Sinclair," George declared. "He probably put the sedative in the cup before he handed it to you," Bess added. "Here's the address," Jim Nelson called out. He handed Nancy a piece of paper with a Virginia address on it. Nancy took it from him. "If you call and tell him we're coming, you'll be aiding and abetting an alleged criminal," she warned. The assistant nodded. "I'm going to leave the gallery," he declared. "I think Taylor's taken advantage of me long enough." As Nancy and her friends were about to descend the stairs to the street, the door opened below. A man entered the hallway. "Martinez!" Alejandro called out. He dashed down the stairs. Ricardo Martinez immediately turned and bolted out the door. Nancy followed Alejandro down the stairs. "Someone call Briscoe!" she shouted. "I'll do it," Bess replied. When Nancy reached the street, her eyes darted in every direction to see which way Martinez had gone. Finally, she spotted him running down the sidewalk to their right. "There he is!" She pointed him out, and they sprinted after him. Martinez was fast on his feet. They chased after him for several blocks, then he darted down a narrow alley. It's a dead end, Nancy realized, elated. He has nowhere to go. Martinez let out several Spanish curse words. Then he whirled around to face them. "I'm warning you, do not come closer," he shouted. As Martinez tried to leap around them, George lunged forward and grabbed the tail of his jacket. He quickly shrugged off the coat and ran. Nancy threw herself at him, knocking him to the ground. She quickly managed to pin him to the sidewalk. George and Alejandro rushed over to help. As Martinez's eyes met hers, she glowered at him and said, "Now, Mr. Martinez, you're going to tell us everything you know about the theft of Lord Pakal." That's chapter 14. Ring around. Oh, the robber. In music? Oh, you just mean like generic hotel music. I thought you were talking about like the Lilac Inn from Secret of the Old Clock. Bongo solo? Were there bongos and I missed them? Bongo solo? The Ring crawls out of TV. Thank you for the claps. Got 2 more chapters, that's it. Oh, Irish bongo music. I don't think they're bongos. I think it's a different kind of drum, but I understand. Okay. Chapter 15. A last-minute confession. As Nancy held Martinez to the ground, he refused to speak. He just shook his head back and forth. A few minutes later, Bess trotted up. "I called Briscoe, and he said he'd be at the gallery any minute," she reported. "I'll wait there and let him know where you are." It didn't take long for Detective Briscoe to arrive in the alley. The officers yanked Martinez to his feet and led him to the van. Nancy and her friends followed the police van to the station. When Nancy entered the interrogation room, Martinez sat in a wooden chair while Briscoe stood pacing around the room. "You know you've been implicated in the theft of the Lord Pakal carving, don't you?" Briscoe asked. Martinez nodded. "Anything you say here can be used against you in court," Briscoe warned him. Martinez shrugged. "I said I don't want a lawyer." He said, "I don't trust them." "I've read you your rights. You know you're entitled to have one here, right?" Martinez shook his head. "I said I don't want one," he repeated. "Okay, let's start at the beginning," Briscoe said. "Tell us who stole Lord Pakal from Beach Hill." "I don't know," Martinez said. Briscoe gave him a skeptical look. "I don't," Martinez declared. "I swear." "Do you know how the carving found its way to the United States?" asked Briscoe. Martinez shifted in his chair. "Come on," Briscoe chided him. "You and I both know what you do for a living." Martinez gave him a dirty look. "I can tell you right now, if you cooperate, we'll go easier on you," Briscoe pointed out. "There's no doubt in my mind you'll do some jail time, but how much time is up to you." Martinez was silent for a moment, thinking about that. "You've got nothing on me," he said defiantly. "We've got assault," Briscoe corrected him. "You attacked Miss Drew here at the Tidal Basin, and nearly attacked her again that night out in Maryland, and we have reason to believe you're involved in the Lord Pakal theft." He paused for a moment. "You can bet that when we bring in Taylor Sinclair, he'll point the finger straight at you, so why not make it easy on yourself and just tell us the truth now?" Briscoe's last remark seemed to work. "I found it," Martinez finally said. "I found the carving of Lord Pakal in Mexico sometime last year." Nancy leaned forward in her chair. "A peasant brought it to me," Martinez went on. "The guy said he saw it on a table of junk at a marketplace near the ruins of Palenque. It looked interesting and very old. I knew it was worth something, so I mentioned it to someone who would know for sure." "Taylor Sinclair?" Briscoe asked. Martinez nodded. "I brought it into the country and showed it to him," he said. "You mean you smuggled it into the country?" Briscoe added. Martinez didn't comment further on that. "Sinclair got very excited when he saw it," he recalled. "He said he could get millions for it and he'd share the money with me." Martinez laughed. "I believed him." "Then Sinclair made some phony documents," Briscoe prompted, "and tied it all to the stuff the Petersons' lawyers were selling." "I guess so," Martinez said. "All I know is that he offered it to a couple of museums and collections. After he sold it to Beach Hill, I asked him for my cut. He kept saying I'd get it soon." Nancy cleared her throat. Sinclair is having money troubles, she said. His assistant hasn't been paid in weeks. Martinez gave a cynical laugh. Well, at least I'm not alone. So what did you do when Sinclair didn't pay up? Briscoe asked. Before I could do anything, Martinez explained, the carving was stolen. Did Sinclair steal it? Asked Briscoe. I don't know, Martinez shrugged. Sinclair told me that John Riggs did it. Briscoe looked surprised. Sinclair said Riggs was jealous, Martinez went on. He wanted it for his museum. Then Sinclair said if I ever wanted to see my money, I'd have to do a little more work, telling certain people that John Riggs stole the carving. Like Alejandro Del Rio? Asked Nancy. He nodded. So that's why Martinez was trying so desperately to get in touch with Alejandro, Nancy realized. And that phone call to me in the middle of the night, Nancy added. That was you too? Martinez nodded. He told me I had to get those documents in the file away from you, he said. That's why I tried to grab them at the Tidal Basin. I knew you were after them, Nancy said, and then you burglarized my hotel room. Martinez immediately looked surprised. No, I didn't do that, he protested. I don't know anything about that. Nancy was surprised. If Martinez wasn't the intruder, who was? So far, Sinclair had carefully avoided getting his hands dirty. It didn't seem likely he'd risk breaking into the hotel room. Tell us about that night at the house in Maryland, she asked, curious. I was supposed to meet Del Rio to tell him face to face the stuff Sinclair told me to say about John Riggs, Martinez explained. Then I saw Sinclair putting you into the shed. I argued with him. I told him he was going too far. But he told me if I wanted my money, I would have to put you out of the detective business permanently. Which you tried to do, Nancy reminded him. I didn't want to, I swear it. Martinez shook his head. I was glad when Del Rio stopped me. Was it you who planted cinnabar and ink and brushes in Riggs' office? Nancy asked. Sinclair made me do that, he admitted. Sinclair wrote the notes, Nancy murmured to Briscoe. He must have stolen the carving, too. Briscoe nodded. Now, if we can just find Sinclair with the carving on him, we've got him. Nancy pulled out from her pocket the slip of paper with Sinclair's country address on it. He's in Virginia, she said, and I've got the address. Why don't I drop in on him? Okay, Briscoe said. Meanwhile, I'll get a warrant and search the gallery in case he hid the carving there. Several police officers led Martinez away, and Briscoe found a Virginia map for Nancy and gave her a special phone number for reaching him. Then Nancy, Bess, George, and Alejandro spread off to Virginia. 40 minutes later, they were winding along a country road. Following the map, they turned onto a dirt lane lined with trees. The road came out to a charming bungalow perched on a low bluff above the Potomac. There was no sign of a car anywhere. It looks like we missed him, Alejandro said worriedly as they all got out of the car. Why don't you and Bess check the grounds, Nancy suggested, and George and I will try inside. As Bess and Alejandro darted around the side of the house, Nancy and George walked to the front door. Nancy was about to knock when she noticed the door was open. Hello, she called, pushing it all the way open. Anyone home? She stepped out into the front hallway. On one side was a dining room, on the other a small living room decorated in English chintz and expensive antiques. It looks like Sinclair took off, George said. Nancy nodded. I guess so, she said, swallowing her disappointment. The problem is, I don't have the faintest idea where he might go, unless Bess and Alejandro followed him outside. She was about to leave the house when she heard a humming noise coming from the dining room. A laptop computer sat on the dining room table. Its screen had dimmed, but it was still on and running. Look, she pointed out the computer to George. He must have left in a hurry. I wonder what he was doing on the computer. Nancy went over to the computer and struck a key. The screen flickered on. Numbers and letters arranged in columns filled the screen. What did they mean? Nancy wondered. Then suddenly she noticed a set of initials. DCA. She'd seen those same initials on a tag on her suitcase when she claimed her luggage at National Airport. He was checking out flight schedules, she exclaimed. What? George joined her by the computer. The cursor flashed under the initials DCA. Opposite them was another set of initials, LGA. What airport uses initials LGA? Nancy asked. LaGuardia? George said promptly. In New York. There's no car here, Nancy reasoned. I'm betting that Sinclair is on his way to the airport. She quickly consulted her watch. How long do you think it'll take us to get to National Airport? She asked, already moving toward the door. I'll bet half an hour, said George. You'd better be right, Nancy said as they hurried outside, because his flight leaves in 45 minutes, and that's barely enough time to find him. Alejandro and Bess quickly confirmed that there was no sign of Sinclair outside. Nancy jumped in the car and started it up. I lost my place. Alejandro directed her to the airport, which was located in the Virginia suburbs across the river from Washington, D.C. 30 minutes later, they pulled up to the main terminal at National Airport. The car's brakes squealed as Nancy barreled into a parking spot and stopped the car. The four of them ran into the terminal. Sinclair's flight was on the Sky Air shuttle, boarding at Gate 16. An overhead sign pointed them to the right. They dashed down a corridor lined with shops, then raced down an escalator. Luckily, there was no line at the security check. They quickly passed through the security scanners and ran for Gate 16 at the end of the hall. As Nancy ran, she yelled to George to call Detective Briscoe on his special number and get him to the airport right away. Nancy reached the gate just as the boarding clerk handed Taylor Sinclair his ticket. "Stop!" Nancy called. "Stop that man!" The startled attendant looked up. Taylor Sinclair ignored Nancy's cry and calmly stepped toward the jetway. "You must believe me," Nancy gasped to the clerk. "That man's transporting stolen goods." "I'm sorry." The clerk held his hands up helplessly. "Please," Alejandro said, rushing over to the desk. "She's telling the truth. That man must be stopped." "The police will be here any moment," Nancy went on. Oh, hang on. "But they may not make it here before that plane takes off. Can you do anything?" Reluctantly, the clerk turned and entered the jetway. He returned a moment later with Taylor Sinclair following behind him. "How charming," Taylor purred when he saw Nancy. "You've come to see me off." "I've come to accuse you of stealing the carving of Lord Pakal," Nancy corrected him. "Ah," Sinclair said, "you must have been talking to that delightful art thief, Martinez." "That's right," Nancy said. "He told us how he smuggled the carving for you." Taylor Sinclair, "That's a good one." He noticed Alejandro. "Helping Miss Drew play detective, I see." "Give it up, Taylor," Alejandro told him. "It's all over. The police know everything." Nancy pointed to the carry-on bag Sinclair was holding. "Is that all you're taking?" "I'm just going to New York overnight to visit a client," Sinclair replied. "Would you like to search my luggage?" "Actually, I would." She took the bag, placed it on the counter, and went through its contents. She wasn't surprised when she didn't find anything. Maybe he had checked some luggage as well and wasn't mentioning that. She handed the bag back to him. "I know you stole the carving," Nancy told him. "All the clues point to you." "And where's your proof?" he asked her, a smirk flitting across his face. Nancy knew he had her there. Without the original provenance documents or the jade in his possession or his fingerprints on any of the evidence, she had no proof. "You can't prove it, and you know it," Sinclair said. He picked up his bag off the counter. "I'll see you when I get back from New York," he said. "We'll have lunch and chat." He began to board the plane. As she watched him go, Nancy felt so frustrated. She knew he was guilty, but there was no way to prove it. Wearing jeans and cowboy boots, Taylor Sinclair walked away casually as if he were an ordinary tourist just about to spend a few days in New York. Then it dawned on her. Cowboy boots? What an odd choice for Sinclair. She'd never seen him in anything less formal than a well-polished black tassel loafer. "Oh my gosh," she thought. "What better place to hide something small than the large heel of a cowboy boot?" That's chapter 15. That's very fitting that Shadow Ranch music would be playing as I'm talking about cowboy boots. Let me see. Hi, Heartless Shroom. What is Cool Daddy Live? And it hosted me for 108 viewers. I feel like that's a bot. Is it? Hello, anybody who happens to be here from Cool Daddy Live. We only have one more chapter. Yeah, it said hosting you for 108 viewers, and I was like, that's why I was like in the middle. I thought it was a bot, but maybe it's not a bot. I'm sorry if I called you a bot and you're not a bot, and anybody who happens to be here. From that, I hope you're having a good night. Okay. Chapter 16. Many happy returns. Stop that man, Nancy cried to the airline clerk. He does have stolen goods on him, and now I know where. This time when Sinclair heard Nancy's cries, he panicked. He wheeled around and bolted toward the right of the terminal. Nancy took off after him. As he raced up the terminal hallway, Sinclair shoved people aside. Suddenly he slipped through a tiny aisle beyond the security check. Nancy was right behind him. The aisle led to another wide corridor. Taylor Sinclair flung himself onto an escalator, taking the moving steps 2 at a time. Nancy charged up the stairs directly to the right. She could hear Alejandro running right behind her. When Sinclair reached the top of the escalator, she threw herself at him. He toppled over in front of a newsstand. Alejandro quickly pinned Sinclair's arms to the floor. Take off your boots, Nancy ordered Sinclair. That's a little unnecessary, isn't it? He said, twisting his head around to look up at Nancy. If you won't take them off, I will, Alejandro threatened him. Then kindly let go of my arms, Taylor said. Alejandro let go but stayed close in case Sinclair decided to bolt again. By this time, Bess and George had caught up to them too and hovered nearby. Wordlessly, Sinclair removed his boots and set them on the floor. Nancy reached for them and twisted one heel. Nothing. The heel stayed on. She looked at Sinclair. For the first time, his face registered emotion, and the emotion was fear. I'm on the right track, Nancy thought. She picked up the other boot and twisted its heel. Immediately, it came off in her hand. Something fell into her palm, a green stone carving. She turned it over. The face of Lord Pakal looked back at her. After looking so often at the photo of the carving, she was amazed to see how tiny the real thing was and how perfectly cut. No wonder it was so valuable and so many people had wanted it. I found it, she exclaimed. She showed the carving to her friends. Sinclair groaned. Then they heard pounding feet. They looked up to see Detective Briscoe turning a corner as he hurried toward them. You got him, Briscoe exclaimed as he saw Sinclair sitting despondently on the floor. Good work, young lady. He approached Sinclair. You're under arrest, he informed him, and you're going to tell us everything when we get back to the station. Taylor Sinclair slumped on a chair next to Briscoe's desk. Ask away, he said with a wave of his hand. Nancy hardly knew where to start. She looked at Detective Briscoe. You solved it, he said. You asked the questions. Nancy turned to Sinclair. We already know how Martinez found the carving and passed it on to you, she began. We know you faked the documents to make the piece look genuine and later changed your copies to cover up the mistake with the zip code. Where are the originals? I sent them up to New York, Sinclair said. They're with a friend. Write down the address, Briscoe ordered. We'll have someone up there to get them. Sinclair wrote down the address and handed the slip of paper to Briscoe. You burglarized my room looking for them, didn't you? Nancy asked. Sinclair nodded. On the off chance that you'd figure out their importance, he murmured, giving her a scathing look, I managed to persuade a chambermaid to let me in. Nancy ignored his put-down. And it was you who wrote those death threats, too, wasn't it? She accused him. Obviously, they didn't have the effect I was hoping for, he murmured. You wanted to scare me off, Nancy said, but I don't scare easily. I can see that, Sinclair remarked dryly. When Vanderheun found me out, I realized I had to get that carving out of Beach Hill as soon as possible. Luckily, I knew just where they kept it, and I managed to sneak away Henrik Vanderheun's keys and copy them. Such an innocent. He never knew. And no one even questioned why I was down in the storeroom because I've been there so often in the past month. Sinclair snapped his fingers. It was that simple. And you framed John Riggs, Nancy continued. You ordered the cinnabar in his name and planted the materials for making the notes in the office. He stared at her silently. Then you used Martinez to spread rumors that Riggs stole the carving, she added, but what did you intend to do with the carving after you stole it? Resell it, Sinclair said. There are lots of people with money who don't care about an object's provenance as long as they like it. And you needed the money, Nancy reminded him. Your gallery is in trouble. Sinclair looked surprised. How did you know that? He asked. You made the mistake of telling John Riggs a while ago, Nancy told him, and you haven't paid your assistant in weeks. He sighed. What does it matter? It's all over now, isn't it? I'm afraid it is, Detective Briscoe chimed in. I've got some people waiting now who'd like to take your fingerprints. Just one more question, Nancy said. There was something nagging at her. Why did you drug me that night at the ceremony? It was you, wasn't it? You were getting too close, Sinclair replied, asking too many questions, and when I spotted you at the party, I decided to try to get you out of the way. I found some prescription sedatives in our hostess's medicine chest. Everything went fine until Alejandro Del Rio came to your rescue. At that, Taylor Sinclair shrugged and stood up. He let Briscoe lead him out into the booking room. It's all over, thought Nancy. The mystery is solved, but one last question remained, what to do with the Lord Pakal carving now that it had been found. It was a glorious spring morning at Beach Hill. The sun was bright in a deep blue sky as a crowd of impatient reporters gathered in the garden for a press conference that Susan Caldwell had called only hours earlier. On a side terrace, Nancy, Carson Drew, Bess, and George stood with Susan Caldwell and Alejandro Del Rio, waiting for the event to start. Well, Alejandro, Susan said with a smile, you got your wish. Lord Pakal is going back to Mexico. Now that we know how he came into the country, there is no way we can keep him here. Alejandro gave her a smile back. My people will be happy to have their king back, he said with a gracious little bow. When Susan Caldwell had heard the whole story, her response was swift and sure. She believed Lord Pakal had to go back to Mexico where he belonged, and Alejandro would be the one to carry him back. The press conference was a way to let the world know that the newly found king was being returned to his home. Nancy was thrilled to see such an amazing turnout for his send-off. Nancy felt a soft tug at her elbow. She turned to find Alejandro facing her with a small jewelry box in his hand. Please accept this as a token of gratitude from my people, and from me for all that you've done to find Lord Pakal, he said. Nancy didn't know what to say. Open it, Alejandro urged. Nancy opened the lid. Inside was a greenstone pendant on a gold chain. Mayan glyphs were carved into the pendant. She looked up at Alejandro. What does it say? The glyphs spell out your name, he said, smiling. It's not a Mayan name, of course, so I had the carver use glyphs that represent the sounds of each letter of your name. He pointed to one of the characters. See this one that looks like a fish? That's the symbol for the letter C. He picked up the carving and placed it into her hand. Isn't it interesting how C in our language looks like something from the sea in yours? He grinned. A Mayan pun. Nancy laughed softly. I will always treasure this, Alejandro, she said. Thank you. And thank you, he replied. Then squaring his shoulders, he headed out into the bright lights of the cameras that awaited him and Susan Caldwell. Nancy fastened the pendant around her neck. The greenstone felt smooth and cool against her skin. Bess and George leaned over to get a look and begin to ooh and ah. Shh, girls, Carson Drew said. The press conference is about to begin. But not before Bess had her say. She nudged Nancy. Now, she whispered, can we finally go to the top of the Washington Monument? End of book! We caught him! Alright, so let's discuss, obviously spoilers, for book and game. So, question mark me, the Profizzi, Lord. I had to do my darks? What does that mean? Oh, you like laundry? I think it's the first time I actually. So, obviously, okay, so the culprit's the same in book and game. However, the ending is completely different. The monolith is not a thing at all in the book. We already had discussed the differences between, like Susan Caldwell is like Franklin Rose in the game. Joanna Riggs is like Joanna Riggs in the game is like Henrik in the book, and Henrik in the game is like John Riggs in the book. Oh, man. That's right. Get some laundry done. I need to do some of that, too. Actually, I've been doing pretty good at keeping my laundry up this week. So, I liked that book, though. It was kind of dark with the cult and the drugs. So, that was a little darker than I expect out of a Nancy Drew book. There was something else that I thought was kind of dark. I can't remember what it was. Oh well. Anyway, thank you guys for watching and listening and hanging out. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you all for being here. I'll be streaming in the morning. The next installment of our Nuzlocke is tomorrow. We are going to have to defeat, we have a rival battle and then Morty, so that's going to be nerve-wracking, but I'm going to try to prepare for that. Have a great rest of the day. Have a great rest of the night. It's 7:30, so have a good rest of the night. Hopefully I'll see you in the morning. The next book I'll be reading is going to be, number 8 of the Lemony Snicket series, The Hostile Hospital, will be the next book I read. I might still be going at noon. I think we're starting at 10, so we'll probably go to like 1 or so, because I have to work tomorrow night. Alright guys, have a great rest of the day. Take care of yourselves as always. I'll catch y'all soon. Much love from me to you. Take care, bye.